Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to Weekend Chat with Researcher. And this time we have session number 4 with us. And we are part of National Center for Biological Sciences, TIFR. And these live stream sessions are a part of a research outreach initiative. We believe anybody sitting at home can understand and learn science and research without any other facilities apart from internet and computer. Now, before we start, I would request you all to enjoy our session to at the fullest and use our live chat session to ask questions from our guest. Now, without further ado, today Ashwin and I will be your host for next 60 to 70 minutes. And so, Ashwin, we saw this short clip, a video clip with bird migration, fish school going on, bacteria moving in a racetrack like thing. Why don't you tell our audience what our session is about and who's our special guest here?
Okay, so as the videos showed, what we're going to talk about today is collective behavior, where groups of organisms or even things do things in a synchronized manner together. And to talk about this, we have with us Shashi Thutupalli. He's a physicist by training, and he's a faculty at NCBS and at ICTS, two centers of the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research, and both centers are in Bangalore. And Shashi's work is in different aspects of physics, and most excitingly, at the interface between physics and biology. So, to not sit between you and Shashi, Shashi.
Hi,
Welcome,
Ashwin.
Shashi.
Hi. Thanks, guys. Thanks for this. So, I guess I'm going to start sharing my screen. And off we go.
Yeah, so Sashi,
Can
like
you see my screen?
why don't you start with like the very basic outline of like what does this collective behavior mean? So in videos we saw that it ranges from our behavior for big organisms like birds, fishes, and to small bacteria, even fungi growing in a plate. So like what according to you collective behavior is?
Right. So, I guess these are some of the first examples that come to mind when someone says collective behavior, that birds are flying together, or fish are swimming together, etc. But I guess I want to take you all back to one of the simplest instances of collective behavior that you can imagine, um, a glass of water.
Oh,
Okay. So this is seemingly simple, mundane, boring, everyday thing, but it is the most striking example of what many individual things can do to give rise to interesting phenomena. And in this case, the one thing, I guess, if we zoom in, is going to be a molecule of water, right? H2O, that we all know. And I guess for the purpose of this discussion, I'm going to use this little circle to denote one molecule, right? And we have all learned in school that water is comprised of many of these uh, molecules, H2O, and all of these are interacting, right? And you might remember that these interactions are coming from the hydrogen bonds, right? And in addition to these interactions, these molecules are also jostling around, right? They're randomly jiggling around. Okay, so that's what, oops, I should restart that. So I have a lot of these water molecules. I said these things are jostling around, and that's what this jostling is what we know as temperature, right? And these interactions are coming because of the hydrogen bonds. And you also know that if you take this water and put it in the fridge, which is you reduce temperature, this thing becomes ice, right? So in ice, the arrangements of these will look much more orderly than in the water, where you have some random arrangement of the water molecules, right? But the fact that that there was a transition from this liquid, it's gone again, right? Okay. So the fact that there was a transition from this liquid to a solid, in this case ice, which is the solid, and water, which is the liquid, and this was obtained by lowering temperature. This is actually a collective action. This is collective behavior, right? So, because what has happened is that this jostling has been reduced because the temperature has reduced, and the interactions now are dominating, right? And the fact now that this ice, which is a solid, is rigid, the property of rigidity is a collective property. It's not the property of one water molecule or a few water molecules, collective action of many of these. The fact that water flows and the fact that it has a viscosity,
right,
is a collective property, right? So this collective behavior faces us at many different instances. So imagine, for example, that these were all little arrows pointing like that. Instead of water molecules, this is now a magnet,
oh,
right? Where you have a south pole and you have a north pole. So a magnet is really collective behavior, where all the spins somehow align and give rise to this magnetic nature.
So, Shashi,
Okay, so collective, I mean, it's not necessarily just fish and birds and so on, right? It's there in water.
Shashi, a quick question. If this is, this is a collective behavior where you need a group of water molecules, is there a minimum number of water molecules, a minimum volume of water that you need to form ice? Is there such a concept?
Yeah, that's a very good question, right? Yeah, that's a very good question, right? So when we talk about something like this phase transition over here, we are talking about a thermodynamic system, infinitely large, right? So that's a very interesting question to ask about where does this thing, what is the rigidity or the viscosity of two water molecules or three water, where does this property start to appear? And that's a very deep question. And there's no very clearly defined answer for something like that, right? I mean, what's a large enough number? An Avogadro number, I guess. Right. So that's one way of thinking about it.
So Shashi, like it has been, I could not ever thought of this collective behavior at this scale, and uh, like whether this is true, this kind of thing is true just for water, or are there any kind of liquids that we see in our daily life where we can see this kind of collective behavior? Like,
yeah, I mean, so all materials that we have around us display this kind of collectiveness or emergent properties. One striking example would be what is referred to as a liquid crystal. Okay, so this is a material that we are all familiar with from our TV screens or laptops, or some of us may have digital watches where this thing called a liquid crystal makes an appearance. So the word liquid comes over there, and crystal is what we normally associate with a solid. So what exactly is this material that seems to have both the liquid and the solid in its name itself? Right. So unlike materials which are made, for example, water, the molecule which we drew as a sphere, liquid crystals are materials where the composite or the component, individual component of the molecule, instead of being a circle or a sphere, it's an elongated object like a rod. Okay, so imagine now that there are many of these rods. So this is also something we know from daily experience. If we have many particles of rice lying around, so this is a situation like that, right? So imagine now that I have a material which is comprised only of these rods, and these rods are kind of strewn around in all kinds of directions. So it's somewhat analogous to the liquid picture that we had earlier, where we have these centers which are positioned randomly. Okay. In the case of the spherical stuff, what we saw was you have an ordered state where the positions of these centers are more or less on a lattice. However, in the case of these rods, there can be another interesting ordering state, which is in between these two, which is that the positions may be at random, but all the directions or the axes of all these things are aligned in the same direction. Right? So the centers may all be random, so it doesn't appear like a crystal or something like that. But if you look at the direction of all these things, it's more or less in the same direction. So it's slightly more ordered than this. Right? So what this one might call, this is what is called typically an isotropic fluid or liquid. And this is what one calls a nematic fluid. Okay, and these are precisely what we use in a watch, for example, right? So if all the molecules are aligned in one direction, then they might pass light through them. But if the light is polarized and is coming in the perpendicular direction, it can block all the light. And that's in fact precisely how the black and the white regions in the digital watch are created, right? But now so again, this transition going from the isotropic to the nematic can be coming from temperature, right? If you lower temperature, this can become this. If you lower temperature further, it can become a further interesting state where you get ordering like this, where you have sheets of these things. But again, if I look from the top, these things are positioned at random. Okay, so there's no ordering in that dimension, but there's ordering in as slices like this. So this is a material which again we know in our everyday life, soap. So soap is a material like this. Okay, so this is what is called the smectic phase, which is Greek, smektikos is Greek for soap. And also in a biological context, we encounter structure like this. For example, if there are two layers of lipid molecules, that's what we know as the lipid bilayer, right? And again, another interesting collective thing is that the sheets or slices slipping against each other is what makes soap slippery.
Right.
It's literally these thin sheets which are like sliding on top of each other, right? And yeah, so this is an example of a material which somewhat lies between a liquid and a solid, right? But has very interesting collective ordering, collective behavior. The flow of these materials is interesting, as we just saw. For example, this nematic, it might be easier to flow in one direction than the other, whereas for the smectic, we saw that there are entire layers which flow together, which cause the slip and things like that, right? So the flow of these materials is dictated by the underlying structure. Okay. So and I also alluded to the fact that this is reminiscent of some biological structures, right? And also another interesting point, I guess, is earlier we said, remember that there are always some kind of interactions between these entities or molecules, the hydrogen bonding in water, for example, right? And in this case, there is a tendency of these interactions to make these rods align with each other, okay? And so there's always a competition between that interaction and temperature. Right. So looks like a lot of biological material like lipids and proteins, etc., operate in this very nice regime where they can self-assemble even at room temperature, giving rise to some non-trivial collective structure against the face of this uh, isotropizing temperature. Right. So that's an example, I guess, of a material which is close to the biological world that we think about, and being of simple constituents which have these interesting properties.
So, Shashi, so here we are looking at fairly very fundamental physical concepts, and if we were to take a jump to say look at birds forming collective shapes, then there are other things there, communication and so on
Absolutely.
that comes in, and there is in between bacterial systems with some intermediate levels of sensing and so on.
Right.
Would you think there would be similar fundamental principles that operate, or would you have to invoke different principles
Right.
once you go to animals and so on?
That's interesting. Right. That's very interesting, because that kind of leads me to exactly what I had drawn out here. Right. So if I show you a picture like this, where on this side I've drawn you a picture of this pneumatic liquid or pneumatic fluid that we were just discussing, and on the right is a school of fish. Right. At least naively one might think, hey, there is some similarity, at least in the way they look. So is the similarity simply in the way they look, or is there more than that, I guess? Right. One obvious difference, of course, like Ashwin, you pointed out, is that the object on the right, the fish, has eyes, it has a brain, it has senses, it's in water, it's swimming, and all these things are able to interact with each other completely non-trivially as compared to the object on the left over here, which is these very simple chemicals which are just interacting via chemical force, chemical interactions, or electrostatic, or van der Waals, or whatever else, right? So one might start to ask the question, saying, okay, if I strip away all these uh, things that the object on the right, which is the fish, have, namely senses, the brain, and things like that, can I still make some kind of a connection or correspondence between these two, right? One obvious difference, if I strip away the sensory and the intelligence and all of that, is that an individual fish is still able to do something interesting, which is move by itself, because it has a source of energy. It's a packet of energy, and it's able to just move by itself. Whereas the fluid on the left, which is this pneumatic fluid, will do nothing like that, right? Unless I come and drive it at the boundaries, like I shear it, or I push on it, I apply an electric field on the sides or something like that, this will not flow or do anything, right? Whereas the guy on the right does. And I guess this is in some ways, again, what we associate as collective behavior, like the example that you alluded to earlier. Okay, but I guess we won't discuss too much maybe about this collective motion, but I will show, I guess, some principles where a simple-minded thinking of pure physical systems is also applicable in scenarios like this, right? But like this pneumatic ordering that we see over here as we decrease temperature, you already kind of see that ordering here in this fish school as they all swim together, right? But you also see this kind of ordering, for example, if I zoom down on bacteria moving together, right, which is here. This is bacteria.
Oh.
They are also rods.
Yes. Yeah.
Right? And they're also rods. And now the bacteria, unlike the fish, don't have, so they're not as complicated as the fish, but they're certainly more complicated than the molecule, the pneumatic molecule. But you see that it does something fish-like in this case. Right? Whereas on the right, this is a movie of actin filaments. So this is even more primitive than the bacteria itself. Right? But what these things share, in some sense, in common, is this elongated rod-like nature. Yeah. So in the case of the bacteria, you know that the bacterium is elongated like this, and here also the actin filaments are many, and so the actin filaments here are propelled because of constant polymerization, depolymerization, and that's the reason. And then again, they come and interact with each other because they're rod-like objects, and then they form these dynamic clusters which are moving together. Right. So one might treat these as simply rods, just like the pneumatic molecules, with this added ingredient that each rod now moves. And then turns out just putting those ingredients is sufficient to get behavior like this in simple models. Right? But of course, if you want to think about more complicated scenarios, then you probably have to put in sensory and information processing and so on and so forth.
That looks wonderful, like bacteria and these small actin filaments. This movie that you showed, it's exactly similar to those fish school moving in the sea. So
Right, and if I hadn't told you, this might even have looked like a bird flock.
yeah, right, right.
And you might ask, what is the rod in the bird flock? I mean, so if again, as scientists, sometimes we are very good at squinting our eyes and ignoring the details, right? So if I squint sufficiently enough, a bird will just look like an arrow, which is just moving in one direction. So I have many of these arrows interacting with each other, right? And again, that's another kind of a rod which are interacting with each other. Or in the case of the magnet, you saw that there were these spins which align together to form an aligned magnetic phase. So it's similar also with all of these objects and the bird flock, for example.
So
Right.
we
So
have a
so
question
like
here.
yeah.
We have a question from the audience from Satvik Anantakrishnan. He asks, apart from the membrane, does the fluid component of the cytosol also display any kind of order per polarization?
Ah, right. Of course, yeah. Oh, good. So of course, because we have lipids at the, so maybe I go back. So of course, if we have lipids, then that's an obvious kind of ordering that we see in the cell membrane, I guess. But then there are also all kinds of proteins and of various different sizes and shapes inside the cytoplasm. Um, uh, I mean, another kind of an ordered structure is the Golgi, where you have stacks of compartments which order. But this kind of an ordering is different from this kind of an ordering that we are talking about, because this seems to be more spontaneous energy minimization kind of thing, whereas this seems to be ordering due to some out of equilibrium process. But in the cytosol itself, because it's comprised of heterogeneous sizes and shapes and structures, I guess there is not the lipid bilayer type of ordering that we might identify. But then there are other things like these condensates of protein molecules, for example, like these so-called phase-separated liquid droplets or organelles that come up. So those are some examples of ordering in the cytosol, I guess.
Sashi, you mentioned about this, like these rod-like molecules or like actin filaments. They are arranged in a particular order. So when we talk about these birds, so I got to know that these birds are like individual arrows which are moving in particular direction. But as a whole in a population, they also move like in a V structure. So how does that help, or how do they like? Why do they travel in a V shape thing? Does
Right. Right. So before going to that, just another kind of structure just came to my mind in response to Satvik's question is, of course, the cytoskeleton, which are comprised of these actin, filaments, microtubules, all of that. That is some kind of an ordered structure as well, right? And it turns out, like for example, the work of Madan Rao and Jitu Meher at NCBS, they've been showing that some of these actin filaments moving on the lipid membrane can lead to ordered structures there as well, and the segregation of these lipid uh, uh, molecules on the cell membrane in small regions, etc. So that's another example that came to mind as we were talking. And yeah, Nitish, the bird flocks, of course, so some of the most striking examples are what we see of these murmuration and things like that, where you have these super large swarms, which are like the video that you showed in the beginning. But then there are also these V formations, and people have speculated for a long time that these V formations kind of help the birds navigate long distances, particularly with respect to being able to take advantage of uh, aerodynamic flows that are affected by these V formations, right? And in fact, there was a very nice study that was done recently where they tracked these they put GPS trackers on birds, and in addition they were able to track the bird wing beats, right? And they looked at these wing beats and also the formation of, so for example, this is one arm of the V over here, which is kind of going like this in the other direction, right? And they found something very interesting and curious. So now these birds are not only objects that are self-propelled or moving, but they're also some kind of they display some kind of a temporal pattern in their flapping of the wings, right? So it's like an oscillator. And so what these guys learned was, depending on the relative position of the bird with respect to each other, they either flap their wings in phase, they go together with each other, right? For example, over here, these two birds, if they're ordered like this, they gain an aerodynamic advantage if they flap their wings together. Okay, because every time they flap their wing, it leaves a air jet behind, right? And in order to gain advantage of that airflow, it's better for them to flap together. But if they're in a configuration like this on the right, it turns out that it's better for them to go antiphase with each other. So if the bird in the front goes down like that, the bird at the back goes up, right? So this is another kind of interesting collective behavior where the birds are not only just coordinating their positions with respect to each other, but they're coordinating their wing beat, frequency, and phase with respect to their motion and where they are in terms of each other. Right. Of course, here they're able to coordinate their wing beats, namely their oscillations, because presumably they're feeling the airflow, they're able to see that one is in front of the other and things like that. Right. So this I thought is a fascinating example of a collective behavior where you have an oscillator which is moving and both of these kinds of things synchronize, both the motion and the oscillation.
yeah.
So, Shashi, with this sort of anti-phase movement, do we know whether this is just some sort of a cognitive thing, or is it just a physical resonance based, or the airflow based? Does it force it to go in a certain way?
Right. So yeah, that's anybody's guess, right? Because it's in the case of the birds, I guess it's very hard to separate their sensory response to these things to just passive response to the airflow, for example, like you're saying, right? I guess the experiment to be done over there is to, I don't know, turn off the senses in some clever way, either make them blind or that they're not feeling each other, and still ask if these things will synchronize in this manner. But people have shown, for example, with passive flappers, right? So if I create two flappers which are just moving because I forced them, and then I put them in a fluid next to each other, then the resistance to the flow is reduced when you have some of these relative phases between the flappers and things like that. So that's only kind of indicative that something like that might be happening here, but that's really hard to confirm, I guess.
So, just taking a detour from the phenomenon to the people and the approaches that one uses to study these, going beyond, uh, just watching them and saying, "Oh, nice," and then and also apart from the physics things. So, how do people think about these collective behavior problems in the physics field, and does it have a long history as well? I assume that it would.
Right, of course. And I mean, I guess let's take the example of synchronization a bit further. Right, let's take the example of synchronization a bit further rather than collective motion, and see how one might start to think about something like that. And to give you an example of another very ubiquitous synchronization phenomenon, without which none of us would be alive, is a beating heart, right? And unlike the case of the birds, again, which is an intelligent individual, sensory individual, and so on and so forth, here the component individual is a cardiac cell, right? It's not as simple as what a uh, simple physical object might be, such as water or the flapping wing motor that we talked about. But it's still a fairly, compared to a bird, it's a fairly simple thing, right? And so here one might ask the question, because this heart is comprised of millions and millions of these cardiac cells, is there a central coordinator which tells these cells to beat in synchrony? Or is the beat some kind of an emergent process, right? So each cell is doing autonomously its own dynamics, and when you put them all together, do they then are they then forced to fall in step somehow and give rise to this one single beat, right? So this is the kind of this is the question, Ashwin, that you raised earlier, right? Is the bird kind of forced to fall in step, or is it doing something intelligently in response? In this case, at least in the case of the heart, when you put a bunch of cardiac cells together, it seems like they're forced in certain conditions, forced to fall in step and give rise to one beat. Okay. So I guess, yeah. So I guess I'll go to another example over here, which is comprised of an intelligent agent, humans. Okay, at least we hope we are intelligent agents. And here's an interesting example of this kind of collective behavior coming up. simply by having been forced into it or not thinking about it per se. Okay, so we all know the example of, or the phenomenon of resonance. I guess a lot of us have learned about this in school, right? So if I have, for example, a pendulum, then I can push on this with an external force, and then if this force is oscillatory in nature, it's oscillatory in nature, then I can drive this pendulum to resonance, which is that it can gain more and more amplitude. Okay. And we also know for a long time that when armies march over bridges, they are asked to march out of step. Right? This is also because of this phenomenon of resonance. The fact that the army marches together is also a synchrony of some kind, but it's practice synchrony. It's practice collective motion. And when they come over a bridge, if the resonant frequency of the bridge matches that of the marching frequency, what then happens is that the bridge adopts these very large amplitudes and it can even collapse, right? So if I have a bridge across 2 points like that and people are marching in this direction, this thing can become unstable like so and gain very large amplitudes and break. Okay, but here's a very curious example of a bridge that was constructed in the year 2000. Okay. By now, engineers know about this phenomenon of resonance. They know that they have to avoid resonance in bridge design and things like that. But then they forgot resonance can act in two different directions, and it led to a very curious phenomenon. So in this was the so-called Millennium Bridge in London, which they opened up across the River Thames to celebrate the millennium. And on this auspicious day, people started streaming onto the bridge in droves. Okay, and what these bridge designers had, of course, very studiously avoided was the resonance that people knew about, which makes bridges collapse, but they forgot that the bridge can also move laterally in the XY, right? And so here in this video, if you look very carefully, I don't know if it plays at the same video rate for you guys, but all the people are sort of marching in step. They've all fallen in step with each other. They're like marching ducks pretty much over there. Okay. And if one looks carefully at the bridge, it's wobbling like crazy side to side. Side to side, it's wobbling like crazy. And the people, so in this case, the people are forced in some sense to fall in step with the bridge, which is moving below them. If they don't fall in step, they will just fall down, they will just collapse, right? So again, one might ask, are they falling in step because people are able to look at each other and things like that? But the company that built this bridge, of course, they got into serious trouble, right? They got into serious trouble. So the city authorities closed the bridge down and the company came and they did some very careful experiments on the bridge. So what they did was they started letting in crowds of controlled size onto the bridge. Okay. And then they measured the wobble of this bridge side to side. And what they noticed was that as they let people in small steps onto this bridge, there was some critical number of people. And then you add like one or two more people onto the bridge, and suddenly it started massively moving side to side. Okay. So this is a little bit like taking water and cranking temperature down and down and down and down and down. And suddenly at some temperature it becomes ice. right? So here you're adding people one by one onto this bridge, and suddenly this thing starts moving. And they also notice that once it starts moving, the people on the bridge were forced to fall in step with each other. Okay, uh, and and then uh, and then these guys thought about this as a synchronization problem, and they wrote a little. We won't go into the details of this model, but they wrote this little model where they treated the people on the bridge as oscillators. Right, so people are walking roughly with some 1 Hz frequency. Right, so you go like left, right with some frequency. So they said, let's ignore the details of vision and sight and intelligence and all that, and just treat them as passive oscillators, which, because they put their step down onto the bridge, they impart momentum onto the bridge. So they cause the bridge to move, right? So let's just incorporate that. And then what they found was exactly this kind of a phenomenon on the left, which the company made a measurement, which is that if they added more and more people or increased this on this bridge, they again saw this phase transition or spontaneous synchrony like behavior, right? So the model is exactly the kind of scenario, Ashwin, that you asked, where there is no agency in some sense, right? These are just passive the only feature is that they are oscillators which continue to keep their cycle, and the oscillators in this case are interacting with a substrate, which is the bridge, and there's a back action of the bridge on the oscillator. And these two ingredients put together give rise to this synchrony of the oscillators, in this case, the people on the bridge.
So, Shashi, so here there is clear there is this phase transition that one can see here as with water and so on. So I just had a question from the kids who are watching it in another room here, and this is got they were asking this about the birds part. So you know that there is they're moving in a certain way as they're flying, and but they also kind of start flying together, right? So um, or do they? I was just wondering, is there somebody who gets started, or do they just it
That's a yeah.
I don't know. So
That's a yeah. That's again. So again, in the case of these birds and fish and so on, I mean, our simple-minded models assume that they're all the same, right? That there are no leaders or anything like that. I mean, some people have started thinking about situations like that, but in this situation, for example, in this little model over here, there is no difference between one oscillator and another, one person and another person, right? Same in the case of the birds. At least that's what we can do as a first guess, I guess, to say that they're all the same, and then ask what leads to this collective behavior if they're all the same. If there is one leader, then that kind of situation is different, but also somewhat easier to imagine in terms of being able to get coordination, right? So, like in an orchestra, if there's someone guiding them, uh, there's one easy way of keeping rhythm. But if the rhythm were to emerge, then it becomes not only more interesting to think about, but also non-trivial, right? So, where is it coming from? Which is the first step, right? Uh, are there little pockets which first come and then it spreads? So there are all these kinds of questions that come up, right? Which is precisely what your kids seem to have pointed out. So one way of thinking about that is, so let's say in this kind of a model where, so for example, for the case of the birds, let's say, they're all able to move in one direction because of interactions, quote unquote, which is the fact that they're seeing and copying each other, right? So you can say that they don't copy perfectly. They make mistakes in this copying, right? So a question to ask would be, how much error can you tolerate and still get one collective flock, right? So similarly, for the case of the magnet, for example, or the or the transition between liquid and ice, it's a competition, like we said, between the interaction and the temperature. So there's the randomizing effect of temperature and the interaction which wants to make things cohesive. Right? So the question, in some sense, is this competition between a randomizing thing and a force which is causing them to align. So yeah, so I don't know if that answers the question, but at least it's one simple-minded way of thinking about these situations where we treat every object to be the same as the other, and there are no leaders and things like that.
So, so when, so how did this whole field originate? Trying to look at synchrony and group behavior.
Right. So it actually originated from a situation like this one that we are thinking about. Here, instead of people, we treated them as simple oscillators, right? And you also asked the question: can a passive object display this kind of a behavior? And so let's actually try to see an example of this model with an object without agency in the sense that it's a simple passive oscillator. Can it give rise to this synchrony? And that directly leads us to where this kind of a phenomenon was first observed. Okay, so let's think about this object, a pendulum. The picture that I'm showing you here is a metronome, and it's a pendulum which you can wind up, and then it keeps a certain frequency or beat depending on what you set the knob to over here. Okay, so now we can imagine in this previous example that I showed you, I didn't say anything about this model at all, except to say that the person was treated as an oscillator. So you might ask, now I have an oscillator with me. If I were to be able to construct a bridge and put this oscillator on that bridge, will they all synchronize? Because that's what this model predicts, right? And I'll first show you this, and this will immediately lead me to the question, Ashwin, that you asked about the origins of, or the first discovery of synchrony and so on. So now here is a video of, instead of people, 30 odd metronomes, and they're all sitting on, instead of a bridge, they're all sitting on a swing over here. Okay, so the swing can move laterally like this. And instead of the people which are marching, there are these pendula which are sitting on this swing, and these two guys just set them all in motion. So just like the people walking left, right, these things are going left, right. So here you will notice that as time progresses, pay attention maybe to one of these letters carefully. You'll see that they start to move, meaning the swing starts to move left to right, exactly like the bridge that we saw, the Millennium Bridge. And if you then now pay close attention to the metronomes, you will see that at least already over here, there's a pocket of metronomes which are all beating together.
Right, yeah.
And these orange ones out of phase, the ones in the middle, the orange.
Yeah. So just wait a little while, and then you will see that more and more and more are falling in step. So the orange ones, Ashwin, that you asked if they were out of phase now, seem like they all belong to one group.
Yeah. For a while, I thought they were perfectly anti-phase, and now it looks like
they were initially,
yeah, at the beginning, I think they were anti-phase.
So that's just a transient dynamic. And now you see that if you look at the letters on the bridge, it's moving quite a bit. and all the metronomes have in fact fallen in step, and they're all synchronized, right? So this is exactly the bridge situation. Instead of people, we have metronomes, right? So this is a passive object which is synchronizing. So this is a physical realization of this model that was written to describe the people's behavior on the bridge. So why does this take us back to the discovery of synchronization? Is because this is exactly what this guy called Christian Huygens, whom a lot of us know because of his studies on light, etc., discovered. Okay, so he discovered exactly this clock phenomenon that we saw with two clocks. Okay, so Christian Huygens in the 1600s, he set himself the task of improving the accuracy of clocks. And they wanted to do this because they wanted to find out if ships were moving east or west. Right? They wanted to detect longitude. And so the idea was that if they had a very precise clock which kept time with respect to the point where they started, they can look at the sun and tell the local time, and then by matching these times, they know at which longitude they are. Right? And then Huygens said, let me do better. Let me actually have two clocks, one set to the local time and one to the original time, and then I can simply say it even more directly. So he was toying around with these two clocks and trying to make the mechanisms more and more precise and so on. And one day, as he was lying in bed sick, what he noticed was that these two very heavy pendulum clocks that he had made and hung on a wooden wall, they always ended up moving in anti-phase motion with each other. Right? So then he did very careful experiments. He started them off in different phases, exactly like what you noticed, Ashwin. Are they really antiphase, or is it going towards a steady state and it's still antiphase and so on? But then he noticed that they were always ending up in antiphase with respect to each other, right? And then he did some careful experiments. So instead of on the wall, he hung them off a wooden beam, and then started tracking their positions very, very carefully, and then monitoring the emergence of this phase locking. Okay. And to his credit, he realized that it's this kind of locking is coming because of vibrations that are being transmitted across this wooden beam by each of these pendulum clocks. Right? Very similar to the swing that the metronomes that they were sitting on. And I find it rather nice that he wrote a letter to his father describing this phenomenon. And he wrote to his father that he's seeing an odd sympathy that the clocks are feeling for each other, right? And the sympathy seems to come from this wooden beam from which they're hung. Right? So this is one of the first recorded instances of synchronization, spontaneous synchronization, and perhaps a careful experimentation with that phenomenon that we know of. Surely people have seen, I'm pretty sure that people have seen spontaneous synchrony even before. For example, if you go out on a dark night, warm, damp night, you'll see fireflies which all flash together and things like that. So people might have been wondering if this is a spontaneous phenomenon or whatever else. But at least as far as we know, this seems to be one of the first recorded uh, experiments, careful experimentations of this phenomenon of spontaneous synchronization.
Yeah, so we have a comment from my mom actually. So saying with the especially with the bridges moving, I think she probably typed it around that time because there is the lag and I don't know when this is typed. So This is similar to what happens when we are walking on a treadmill. That you start, the people also start to sway.
Possible. I mean, yeah. So I guess the treadmill also is some kind of a forcing,
Yeah.
because it has it has its pace and rhythm, and then you are kind of forced to fall in step with that rhythm, I guess. Yeah. Yeah. Except the difference, of course, is that the treadmill is a forcing in the sense it has a motor which is running. Whereas in the case of the bridge by itself was not moving. It was moving because the people on it were moving. So there is a non-linear feedback in that case. Whereas in the case of the treadmill is acting as a forcing on you, and you're the sort of passive actor in that case.
So I guess with the bridge, so it's like the people marching set of the bridge, and then that in turn made people to sway again in this left right direction. Is Am I getting that right?
Right. So this treadmill example is a good one, right? Except instead of the treadmill moving by itself, here, like I said, the bridge is moving because the people on it are moving, right? So if there was one person walking on it, the momentum transfer between the one person and the bridge is not sufficient to cause it to move, right? And that is precisely this finding over here, right? You need some critical number of people to be moving on the bridge in order for it to move at all. And then once it starts moving, then the other person on it will have to fall in step, right? Otherwise, that person loses footing. So once that person also falls in step, then it only contributes to the thing moving more. So you get this sort of runaway effect. Yeah.
Okay, so moving on from this, so if we start off with a system in synchrony, and then if things start to break down, does that have a structure to it, or is that just going to go haywire?
Right. So you're asking that, for example, if in these many metronomes, which were instead of being out of sync to start with, they were all synchronized to start with, and then some agency came and they went out of sync, what would that look like? I guess, right? So one interesting example to think of broken synchrony is again going back to this example of the heart. Right? So when everything is nice and normal, when all the cardiac cells have synchronized with each other, then you get one heartbeat, right? Which is the normal healthy condition that we all want and aspire for. But then there are these rather strange situations called arrhythmias, which are not so infrequent. And this is these cells falling out of synchrony with each other in some way, right? So in this case, this is what's called a ventricular fibrillation. And what you're seeing here is that instead of all these cardiac cells uh, synchronizing with each other and producing one beat, here there are bunches of cells which seem to be closer in synchrony, and there is a wave of synchrony traveling across the heart. Right? And as a result, the heart cannot beat together, and this leads to an irregular heartbeat or the lack of a beat at all. Right? And in fact, the transition from here to here is due to many different causes. And what ideally people want to do, because this is an unfavorable situation, is in fact drive this to synchrony, right? So this is what people normally do by giving jolts of electricity, meaning you're forcing everything from the outside to an external pulse to kickstart everything together, right? And hopefully then get one beat again. So that's one example, I guess, of this lack or losing of synchrony, and that being an undesirable situation. I can also give you another example of losing synchrony in this passive oscillator case that we talked about, metronomes. Okay, so it turns out that the way you connect these oscillators is also important to get synchrony or not get synchrony. Okay, what do I mean by the way they connect? Earlier in the example of the bridge or the metronomes on one swing, all the oscillators are connected to all the other oscillators through the bridge or the swing in this case, right? That's uh, that's the means by which they're connected to each other. Okay, so now let's look at the following situation where the connection is slightly different. Meaning, I have one whole population of oscillators which are coupled to each other. I have another whole population of oscillators which are coupled within themselves. And the two populations of oscillators are coupled to each other with some other weak coupling. Okay, like there are two bridges across the river Thames, and there are lots of people on them, and the two bridges are connected by some kind of a spring or something. Okay, and in this situation, remember what I showed you earlier was that if I just had one bridge, one swing, and a set of oscillators, they all will synchronize, right? So we should also expect, in fact, that this will also synchronize, right? And by coupling these two together, it's like having two individual oscillators coupled to each other. So we might expect actually synchrony, complete synchrony in this case. But depending on the strength of this coupling, it turns out something rather curious happens. So here what you're seeing is that there's one population which is fully synchronized. And there's this other population of oscillators which can never synchronize at all. Even though if I remove this connection between these two, both of them will synchronize. Okay, so that's a rather interesting or funny situation where everything is symmetric. You expect that what is happening on the left should happen on the right, but the left behaves differently from the right. And this is a completely non-trivial losing of or breaking of synchronization, if you want to think about it that way. Okay, and whether one sees the examples of this kind in nature is an open question. And if there are any uses or anything like that for this is also an open question.
So, Shashi, we're starting to run out of time. And to close, actually, we've got a couple of questions. The first one is came through Instagram, which I just checked because Nitish forwarded it to YouTube from Arushi. So which is linked to breaking synchrony. So she's asking about do can these collective behaviors sustain efficiently against external perturbations and environmental changes, and if yes, this means, for example, that under predator attacks, not only must information be propagated fast, but also cohesion should be retained. Does the density change or do they disaggregate? And also, don't high population densities usually lead to negative consequences, as maybe increased competition for resources, higher disease transmission, and in some sense, attention by predators as well. So I think it's basically starting with breaking synchrony. And then when something of this happens, for example, with the birds, with predators attacking, should the information be propagated fast, and should cohesion also be retained in some way? So what are the consequences? In
Yeah, so this is a
specific
very
context of a
interesting
predator attack.
question. This is a very interesting question because this person, I think Arushi, right? See,
Yes.
she seems to have recognized, or she seems to know this fact that there is this very interesting connection between the transmission of information, density, and somehow density being at competition for resource and things like that, right? So there seems to be a paradox arising in. Uh, uh, so of course, if you have a very high density, you expect that information propagates fast. But then if you have very high density, then you're at competition for resource, clearly pointing to the fact that there might be some kind of a sweet spot. That's one point. And second, so indeed, when there's a predator attack on a group, it has to stay cohesive, because if you're not cohesive, then the chance that you're attacked further by this predator increases. Um, but at the same time, you don't want to remain as a group because you can be attacked as a group, right? So yeah, so you have not only this interaction between the individuals, which makes them stick together as a group, but then they need to have some kind of an antagonistic relation with an intruder. Stay away from the intruder, but stay together, right? So there are two forces that are balanced in leading to the collective behavior, right? And regarding the resource, I guess it's a slightly different. It's not exactly in this context that a resource comes up, I guess. It's in achieving high population numbers or something like that you have competition for resource.
So this is actually a good question because it clearly
It's a
um,
great
uh,
question.
underlines the fact that there are a large number of parameters that can influence and be influenced by collective behavior, and understanding all of this is probably some way away in different contexts. Um,
Yeah, and the interactions are very non-linear, right? So I guess
yeah.
that's yeah.
So one final question we have again from Satwik, and he's going back to his lipids and the cellular protein. So in that way, we go back from all the synchrony, going back to the collective organization where we started. So the question is, would there be any significant momentum transfer between lipid membranes and proteins embedded in them? Would you expect to see any locally synchronized motions between these proteins?
Huh. Well, these are overdamped systems, right? So inertia will not play a big role in these cell membranes and things like that. But there could be other sources of them interacting with each other and transferring momentum and forces and things like that. Uh, Indeed, I mean, so for example, steric interactions, as in the case of these actin globules that you see over here, because they're consuming energy moving, but they're also pushing on each other. And as a result, you see them forming some kind of a coherent structure. Likewise, in the lipid membrane, you have probably viscoelastic interactions, long-range fluid interactions, etc., which can give rise to proteins feeling each other from a distance, and as a result, you get some kind of interesting ordering or structure formation over there.
Okay, great. So we should end here, maybe. Yeah. Or yeah, great. So thank you, Shashi, for joining us for this outreach session. And like for me personally, I could not have ever thought of this collective behavior, this motion of in a big collection of individuals or groups at this level. And definitely you must have encouraged young minds out there who are like in lockdown and enjoy these sessions and intrigued a basic idea of research in them. So thank you everyone for joining us today. And like please share video for, and feel free to use them for any education purposes. And do like and follow, subscribe, as people say, uh, our YouTube channel, and encourage everybody around you, uh, irrespective of their age. um, Please spread the word of research. And thank you everyone. So please write back to us for any suggestions. And if any topics that intrigue you, we might cover in our few sessions forward. Thank you everyone.
Thank you. See you next time.
Okay, thanks.